Today is Holocaust Remembrance Day. At least 11 million people were killed during the Holocaust. 6 million of those people were Jewish people. Today we remember the horrors of the Holocaust in honor of the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943. A Huntsville rabbi tells us more about the significance of the day.
And it's extremely important to do something on the Day of Remembrance to remember what happened during the Holocaust and to remember what the Jewish people went through during the Holocaust. But equally as important is to do something and do an active deed, an active, what we call in Judaism, an active mitzvah, which means a good deed, to go forward and do something towards Judaism, to preserve Judaism. And that is specifically what our enemies try to take away. And by us continuing Judaism and preserving Judaism, that's how we are able to show our enemies that we are fighting back and we are here to stay.
Rabbi Cohen explains how non-Jewish people can honor this day on RocketCityNow.com.